All right, so we finally come to the end of all of these big effects of, or political effects of the Industrial Revolution, and we're finally going to wrap this all up in a nice package called the Revolutions of 1848. So, what we're going to do is I'm going to break this down into three pieces. And in this first video on 1848, we're going to look at some of the background factors and some of the context for what's about to happen. In the next two videos, we'll look at what happens in France because it is a direct continuation of what happened in 1830 and 1832. And then in our final video on the series, we will look at what happens in the Germanies. So we'll look at the German Confederation and in Austria and see how these revolutions affected those places too. But to start, we're just going to do a little bit of stuff on the background. What caused this to happen? And so what we're going to see here is kind of the interaction of some of these political ideologies and the fallout of those interactions. So these revolutions are the culmination of a lot of different economic, social, and political trends. So a lot of the stuff we've been doing up to 1848, these ideas are all going to start to come together right here. And we're going to pick the story up of 1848 with the potato famine. So when we talked about the potato famine, we talked about the potato famine as a social phenomenon. And it was. It was a very important social phenomenon. But it was also an economic phenomenon. And that's how the revolutions of 1848 get started as a result of the potato famine and the quote-unquote hungry 40s. So a lot of people died as a result of the potato famine, and a lot of people became catastrophically poor. So the potato famine led to a lot of dead people and a lot of desperately poor people. And because people were desperately poor or dead, that drives down demand for manufactured goods. Dead people don't buy stuff, and poor people can't afford to buy stuff. So demand drops, which also leads to a drop in the demand for labor. So people lose their jobs. And in this era, this is before any sort of government welfare for unemployment. So these newly unemployed people rely on charity or begging, or some even resort to crime. But this is a bad time to be poor because there's not a whole lot of help to be had. And this cycles. So, as there are now more poor people, further drops demand for manufactured goods, which leads to further layoffs. This is essentially an economic depression as a result of the potato famine. And we didn't really deal with the potato famine as an economic phenomenon because we're going to deal with it now as we lead into 1848. So all of these poor people have a lot of time on their hands to stew over how crappy their lives are. And it's no coincidence that socialism is becoming more popular in the 1840s. In fact, the Communist Manifesto was published in February 1848. So right when all of this stuff is about to start, that's when the Communist Manifesto gets published. So there was a growing interest in those ideas. And I think it's safe to say that these conditions fed into a growing support of socialism and Marxism. So that's one set of trends that we see lead into 1848. Another set of trends is that liberals across Europe, maybe most specifically in France, but really all over Europe, are becoming increasingly frustrated that they can't participate in government. So there are rich people who aren't quite rich enough to vote. And so they're becoming really frustrated that they can't participate. And what makes it even worse is they watch their counterparts, people who look just like them, in the United Kingdom, and the United States vote and participate all the time. And they want to do that. Why is it fair that Americans and the British are allowed to do this and we can't? And another group that we just introduced in the video right before this, the nationalists in the Austrian Empire. So when we're thinking about groups in the Austrian Empire, we're thinking about Italians, Hungarians, Czechs, and there are more, but these are the ones that are probably the most vocal about being nationalists. Along with the Germans spread out through the German Confederation. They all want to vote for themselves as well. And so, in this sense, the nationalists in the Austrian Empire and in the German Confederation have the same interests as the liberals in France. They want the same thing as the liberals do. So being a liberal in France was more or less the same thing as being a nationalist in Italy. You wanted the right to vote for yourself. You wanted a say in government. So what we're going to do is take a quick look around at 3 places where the revolutions of 1848 happened. So we are going to look at France. And we're going to look at Austria. And we're going to look at Germany. Now, these two are closely related. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that these revolutions took place all over Europe. So we're going to see the same thing happen everywhere in Europe with 2 exceptions. And we'll talk about those 2 exceptions in a second. So there are other places where this is going to happen. We're going to look at these 3. Other places where this is going to happen, we're going to see this happen in Italy. We're going to see it happen in Czechia, which at the time was called Bohemia. Hungary. We'll come back to these places when it serves the story. But we're not going to talk about these places just yet. We're going to talk about them separately. So we'll talk about Italian unification. We'll talk about the formation of Austria-Hungary. I think the Czechs will bring in when we talk about the road to World War I. But all of these groups are going to get their own story, and all of them are involved in 1848. We're just not going to talk about all of them right here. We're going to focus on France, Austria, and Germany. Now, like I said, there are two exceptions. And those two exceptions are the UK and Russia. And there's a reason why this doesn't happen in those places, and they are diametrically opposed. This doesn't happen in the UK because pretty much everything the revolutionaries are asking for in France at all, so all of these places, has already been granted. There's no reason for them to rebel. They have everything they want. This doesn't happen in Russia for the opposite reason. It's because the Russians are so conservative and reactionary that no rebellion got traction. Like, there was no movement in Russia. They were too conservative. In fact, the Russians will help finally squash these revolutions in 1849. So the Russians are going to come in and pour water over everything. The stuff that's still going on, the Russians are going to extinguish it. So we don't see this happen in Great Britain, and we don't see this happen in Russia. But we do see it happen just about everywhere else in Europe. Now, here is a general pattern that we're going to notice. And the general pattern that we're going to see is almost an exact replication of what happens in France in 1830 and 1832. So, at first, all the different political groups align with a common purpose. And usually that common purpose is overthrow the current government. Now, they all have different reasons for that. but they all have the same goal. They all want to get rid of the current government. But then some of the groups are happy with that outcome, and others want to go further. And so the groups that were formerly all aligned now come out of alignment and they start to fight each other. And it's at that point that the overthrown, usually conservative leaders come back and pick off the divided groups, usually with some Russian help. And things go back to the way they were. Which pretty much follows what happened in 1830 and 1832 in France. In 1830, you had the rich bankers, the kind of middle class people who just lost their right to vote, and then you've got all the regular people who just lost their jobs because the king banned freedom of the press. They all came together and they all agreed we've got to get rid of the king. But the new king really only worked for the rich people. And so the poor people said that we need to get rid of the current king because he's not helping us. But the rich people were happy with him. And so the next revolution fell apart. And that's the pattern we're going to see throughout 1848 and into 1849. So in our next video on the sequence of 1848, we're going to look at what's going on in France, because the once liberal Louis Philippe is going to become much more authoritarian, and all of the political groups are going to align with a common purpose, which is to overthrow the current government, but they're all going to have different reasons for doing it. So we're going to repeat what we just did in 1848. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.